Hi everyone, welcome to our latest episode of Rewrite the Rules. Today we have with us Minette Navarrete. She is the president of Kickstart Ventures Incorporated, a venture capital firm based in the Philippines. She is also a member of the board of directors for a couple of companies and brings with her a very diverse range of experience spanning from online gaming to the FMCG world, and there's a lot more in between. Welcome to our podcast, Minette.
Gosh, thank you for inviting me, Regina.
Minette, when you graduated from the university with a bachelor's degree in management engineering, did you envision that this is where your career journey will take you?
So the short answer is no. So everybody asks about career path, and I never used that for myself because career path to me implies a journey towards a fixed destination. And I think my career is less destination and more discovery. A bit of exploring the world as it unfolds, figuring what I can learn and do and create and contribute. So as you said, it's pretty diverse. And so the obvious career starting point, at least for me, was marketing, which explains why the first half of my professional life was very much around creating value through brand-led businesses. So Unilever, L'Oréal, Levi Strauss, or trying to shape worlds and experiences, whether it's in a physical environment like Shangri-La Plaza shopping center.
Yes.
Nowhere in there was venture capital and investing. So it's a surprise and a discovery.
Yeah. I love what you said about, it's a discovery versus the destination. Are there any, stories that you could share with us about some unexpected turns that your career
Maybe
took?
when I think back to where I made decisions, I didn't have an industry in mind as such. I was interested in investing in myself, in learning more. And therefore, for me, what mattered was to find where the largest delta was. Where was I completely new? Where would I offer a fresh perspective? So I joined Globe Telecom in '06. It was before smartphones and apps were everywhere, before data services and broadband were widely available. So I hadn't joined because there was all that. There was none of that. I joined because of the possibility of, and I thought the necessity of innovation. So I knew coming in that telco growth anywhere in the world was, it followed kind of a universal playbook. We also knew that it was a time where the industry was approaching maturity and full penetration. And for that, there was no playbook. And so I thought any telco in the world could seize initiative at that point. And it was pretty obvious that to keep creating value for our customers, we'd need to innovate. But we couldn't invent or build everything in-house. It's going to be too expensive. And everything was changing. So there was a lot of risk. There was very little certainty. Venture capital is a great technique for resolving this dilemma. At its best, it supports innovation through funding a range of initiatives that can deliver scale and impact. But it's still very growth focused, very innovation driven, very capital efficient. So I kind of walked myself into venture capital, not because of venture capital, but because of innovation and the excitement of change.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you for sharing that. I noticed that you worked in industries that were predominantly male at some point. So what is it like to be a woman in these different fields?
Interesting you should point that out. I think when I started out, mainly in the marketing function, gender wasn't much of an issue. There were equally brilliant and senior men and women. But in tech, whether we're in a startup, and especially the leadership team, would typically be predominantly male. And this was certainly the case in the year I joined Globe Telecom. Though I should hasten to add, this is no longer the case now. But you point out correctly, venture capital, famously male dominated. One of my friends had said this adage: pale, male, and stale. And the typical, right? And the
Yeah.
typical profile is it's somebody white Western, white Western man with an MBA, with many years in the saddle, and friends in the social register. It was very hard to break in. And I think what that meant was there was a strong need to deliver results, to be visibly an equal, but not identical, to
Mm.
be different, but to understand the language, to understand and respect the rules where the rules make sense, or challenge the rules when they make no sense. And certainly building, one of the things we're very proud about is Kickstart is about the total is about half female, both the team and the leadership team as well as the company in total.
Yeah. Minette, I'm sure you faced a lot of challenges before reaching where you and the company have reached. And, I'd love to hear, especially around, you mentioned the social circle or the networking aspect or the visibility aspect. How did you overcome challenges there?
Um, I guess because of the approach I had taken, it was always going to be a challenge to be the new person, the newbie, whether it
Right.
was in the company or in the industry. To me, on one hand, that had certain benefits. If you're new, you've got clear eyes, you have no preconceptions, you can ask very objective questions. You kind of hold a mirror up to the organization, to the industry. But you're right. On the other hand, you're not aware of all the data. You don't know whose toes you might be stepping on. Um, and I think especially in Asia, you aren't seen to have yet earned the right to push for change because you're new or because you're female in a male dominated industry. I think that was tough in the beginning when it was uncommon. I think a couple of things have made a difference. One is obviously investing in learning, investing in asking questions, building up the data. I think it's possible as you progress in your career with the supreme confidence of youth to have strong opinions. And when you're young and curious and opinionated, it's a real risk. And I think it was important for me to build positions based on objective data, which I could only get if I was open, if I asked questions, if I was willing to put myself out there to be the person who knew least in the room rather than to be the person to assert that I was the smartest person in the room. I realized, Regita, it's almost easier to persuade a boss to support change versus to persuade a very successful peer. Because I think when you enter a company and you've got peers, the folks who are most successful have the most to lose if there's any change to the status quo, to the rules of the game. It was there that I learned that whenever I had made a career change, whenever I had come into a new industry, a new company, it was also important for me to offer constructive ideas, to ask questions openly, to listen and learn. I think another challenge maybe is the difficulty of persuading large enterprises, well established boards, about the inevitability of an industry maturing and therefore the necessity of adopting innovation. I remember being in pitches where we're presenting to board directors, and we've been in rooms where we would pitch, and somebody would say, I don't need to hear the pitch. I just want to know if this is approved and something goes wrong, who loses their job? Because that's the only
Yeah.
thing. And it takes some skill and some practice to bring everybody back to discussing information, discussing data, building a compelling case, but also being upfront about the risks, and showing a plan that is methodical about risk taking. And then that too has been a learning experience, I find, for myself as well as my colleagues, and as well as I think the boards of the companies that we've worked with.
Okay. And, I was just reflecting, was it difficult or different for you because you were a female leader versus do you think it would have been different for a male counterpart?
I think there is some difference, and I don't know if this is a gendered thing, Regita, but certainly I was brought up to not interrupt someone speaking. And I know that the data in research shows that men interrupt women more frequently than women interrupt men. I certainly have found myself interrupted quite often while I'm presenting. Or the flip side, where I'm presenting and I see people on their phones, and you think, well, if this isn't worth your time, why are we in this room? Moments like that, even if they were quite senior board members, I would pause. And I think the silence catches everyone's attention. And people know when they're not paying attention. Um, so sometimes it's verbal, and I'll say, would you like to finish that email? I guess it's important and urgent. Or sometimes I'll just be quiet. And that's worked. I think over time people have become more conscious of how their behavior in a meeting impacts. And I guess in a way, being on all these online meetings, being on Zoom, because of the very small focus,
Yeah.
forces all of us to pay greater attention, particularly if cameras are on.
What strategies did you build to do that, to do your job online, or how did you adapt to a new world where everything was being done remote and virtually?
I think for myself, because sometimes we're pitching, I certainly watched all the YouTube videos I could about how do you present, because I love being in rooms with founders, with partners, with colleagues, and networking digitally was not something I was used to. But I also went to as many webinars as I could, and I'd reach out on the chat so that you can, particularly in a room full of, maybe a dozen, 2 dozen people, I'd make sure that we could send a message to say hello and maybe swap contacts so that even at the end of the webinar or the Zoom session, we send quick notes, just to connect and make sure we could have the opportunity of a conversation at some future date if it was necessary. I've always liked the handshake. I've always liked the gesture of a card. It's been a relief and a joy to be back to meeting people in person.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think. How do you continue to network if you have to do that online?
So LinkedIn's been a good tool. A year ago, we had an intern come join us, and for her final project, she made this really compelling presentation showing the data about how, all you need to do is you engage on LinkedIn. She showed, here are the stats on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Instagram. For what we're trying to do, focus on LinkedIn, share more, repost more, engage. And she made such a big difference that all of us thought, we have to do this. And so I did start to use LinkedIn a little bit more.
So thank you for sharing that. I'm sure, in this long journey, you've got a lot of people who supported you, like mentors or allies, or you probably also had some strategies that help support you in your career in maintaining a balance. I'd love to hear who those people are, or what are those strategies that have proven most effective for you.
My first mentors from Unilever, generally bosses I've worked for. My very first boss, Maricel Narciso, probably asked me the sharpest questions about proposals. I think from a C-level perspective, um, the board directors at Shangri-La Plaza, and my CEO who hired me to be COO, my first C-level role. They all taught me to perform at a higher level because I had learned how to be a manager. But at this point, they were teaching me board level responsibility, how to deal with complexity. We often hear about the obligation to dissent. They taught me not just that, but also the skill to dissent constructively. And those folks have great impact. I think also in my current role, and I think venture capital is probably the highest risk role I've ever taken. Um, and if we've made progress, it's because my colleagues at Globe shared what they understood about tech. Because you have to remember, all of my experience until gaming had been traditional industries. From my current boss, Ernest Koo, CEO of Globe Telecom, he taught me the value of timing and the absolute importance of independent thought. Um, Ernest can be brutally direct, and that toughens you. It teaches you to defend your position, and it certainly taught me to prepare. When I sort of pull back and I think about what lessons I learned, I have a really corny acronym. So if you think about my mnemonic device is START. Um, the S is for sharing, to keep sharing. Share thoughts, even if your thoughts are different. Questions, even if I feel they might be stupid questions. Frequently, also, I guess, sharing credit. And that I find is something that, in my experience, the women do more frequently than men. Sharing creates and reinforces allies. As you pointed out, there's share, there's think. Um, I read this book about You're Not Your Device. And this is about understanding that we can't sort of reflexively post everything that's going on. It's also important to constantly think the deep and distant and occasionally difficult thoughts, to consider the data, because that's the way to master your biases. It's the way I've helped myself keep my emotions in check, decide based on data, and to give myself the gift of reflection. The third thing for me is to act. So to act in a measured and measurable way, to consider the impact you intend to make. This is a reminder to innovators and investors that when we make investments, when we support something, we need to think of the consequences of what we support, because especially in digital, the ability to extend and to have impact is so great and so rapid and frequently so uncontrollable. So it's important that as we start to act, that we know where the where the extent of impact is. Last two things, obviously, it's venture capital. Risk. Risk is important. Risk taking is like a muscle. I think it's scary when you've never done it, but you can train yourself. And like exercising, you learn to manage the pain, you learn to minimize any damage, you learn to enjoy the gains. So I think I like where I like being in unfamiliar places where the risk is greatest, but also that's where learning is greatest. And I guess the last piece of my start, so
Yes.
share, think, act, risk, is teach. Because I think the most enduring thing I can build is not just a business, but really the next generation of leaders. So any opportunity to teach, um, everything is a teachable moment. I think it's such a gift and a blessing to have that opportunity. That's my corny mnemonic um, to
Not at
list these.
all. I think it is fantastic. It's fantastic. I think you should trademark it at some point. One final question for you, Minette. In you have such a busy life. I mean, you're on the board of directors for companies. You're running Kickstarted, ventures. How do you manage to balance work and life?
So I have one son, and he was digital from quite a young age, which meant that it didn't matter where I was, where he was. We were always connected. The rule for me is always that if my son phones, I will pick up, and I can be in a meeting. When I was in Shangri-La, and I had we were wrapping up the meeting with my chairman at the time and my CEO. And then my alarm comes up and I look and I say, we're going to have to finish this by 2:30 because it is Halloween and I have to make it back in time to get my son ready for trick or treat. And I think it's important to always acknowledge that our lives are not just work. My son knows that he can phone, and when he was too young to understand time zone differences, it meant that it didn't matter where I was. He would phone if he wanted, and we'd be on the phone. I would not be the person I am without the lessons I learned from parenting. Um, I think parenting makes me a better leader.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What I'm taking away from our conversation definitely is your personal mantra of success, which is start, like you said, share, think, act, risk, and teach. I think that's really very nice, and I'm going to see how I can apply it into my own personal situations. And the second is something that you didn't say, but I noticed throughout the conversation you kept talking about how you're not your device. And I think there is a certain value in, it kind of resonates with your own value actually, where you said, I want to keep learning. I want to keep understanding the world as it's changing. And for me, I feel reading is such a great way to do that. And there was something else you said as well about learning, where you said that when the pandemic happened, you moved to, you attended webinars on how to actually have great conversations online, how to make eye contact, how to set up the camera. I mean, there is a lot of intention behind your learning, and I really love that.
I think there's so much to learn. And I do want to say, by the way, it's never a solo act. I read somewhere the CEO lives in the future and the COO lives in today. And I think part of what makes it possible for me to live in the future is I know that today is being taken care of. I've had the great fortune of a co-founder, Dan Siazon, um, who, frankly, he and I couldn't be more different from each other. Um, and so there are loads of disagreements and debates. And it reminds me that, on a frictionless surface, a wheel makes no progress. So I think if there's any progress we've made, it's because Dan, but also the rest of the team have brought their own perspectives. Thanks, Regita, also for just asking these questions and reminding me to reflect on everything I've got.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being so open, for sharing your vulnerable moments in your career with us. Thank you for also being so uh, collaborative. Like, you've mentioned so many people's names in this conversation. I can just see there's a lot of gratitude that you have for the community and for the allies and the people who've supported you. So thank you so much for the attitude of gratitude, right? And thank you for being part of our podcast. It was a great conversation.